Very important distinction. So, and this appreciation developed in the mid '90s. Is your
Yeah, and here's what happened. So you had this guy in Italy named Giovanni Fava saying, I think we're sensitizing the brain to depression long term with these drugs, okay? And this is the first major problem. And a very famous psychopharmacologist named Ross Baldersarrini at Harvard Medical School, he's one of the fathers of psychopharmacology, says, we really need to investigate this. This is what our research is showing. He says it's not pleasant to consider, but we have to look at this. Are these drugs depressogenic? And then there was a response by a psychiatrist at Columbia University named Donald Klein, and he says this: listen, stop talking about this. Nobody's interested in this question. The FDA is not interested. The NIMH is not interested. Nobody is interested. We're just not going to investigate this, and you don't see the research done that would investigate it. And that's the moment you can really see psychiatry sort of betraying its patients, because here you have mainstream people writing about it. Seems like over the long term we're turning depression into a chronic course, that maybe these drugs in fact are depressogenic over the long term. Major guys saying we have to investigate this, and now here's another major psychiatrist in America saying, stop talking about this. We don't want to even think about this.
My suspicion is that the first one was an honest, high-integrity clinician who wasn't necessarily in massive conflict of interest through subsidies through the drug companies.
Well, you're exactly right, and that's what he writes back. This dialogue actually happened in writing, and Fava writes back, well, maybe you're not interested where you're under the influence of pharmaceutical companies, but we're interested, and we're going to keep on trying to understand what's going on. But that, in terms of, obviously, I think when people have a major depressive episode, they do have two desires. One desire, of course, for the depressive episode to, terminate, get out of that, that awful feeling. But then they also want to think, how am I going to do long term? And they need to know the long term information as well. And long term with antidepressants is a very sort of discouraging course. Mm-hmm. And by the way, and you were talking, we can go into this in a bit, because Britain actually is starting to switch its recommendations in terms of how you treat depression. But you talked about natural lifestyle changes or things you can do to recover from depression. And there was a study by Duke University Duke University researchers in the late 1990s that had this, this one really needs to be known. It had this design. It had three groups. There was exercise only, exercise plus drug, and drug only, okay? And after 6 weeks, the drug-only group was doing a tiny bit better than the other two groups, okay? Then they followed up for 10 months, and their hypothesis was that the best stay-well rate would be seen in those with drug plus exercise. But in fact, by far, it was in the exercise-only group, and therefore on the long term, actually the drug being added to exercise was a hindrance to long-term stay-well rate, and a notable one, by the way. So there's an example of what is sort of a natural or healthy thing to do to recover from depression. Duke University's researchers looked at this. They said, wow, exercise can help you sort of respond acutely, but then it helps you stay well in addition. And just so you can see how mainstream this is becoming in Britain, Britain has an advisory group to the National Health Service called the NICE, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. And it recently, I think it was about 4 years ago, issued a paper on depression. It said, at least for mild to moderate depression, antidepressants should not be a first line of therapy. They're just not that effective even over the short term, and as you said, they have all these side effects. So we need to look for alternatives. And one of the things they said is exercise, such that now in Britain, you can actually go to your GP, and the GP, you tell your general practitioner that you're depressed, he'll write you out a prescription for exercise. And with that prescription, you go and meet with an exercise counselor. That exercise counselor sets you up with a program, usually at a gym, because they also believe in additional exercise, it's good to be in social groups, community groups. You now get either a reduced rate or a free rate at a gym for 6 months. Part of the exercise might be green gyms, and by that they might be gardening outside, nature walks, repairing trails, hiking trails. And they are finding that, people really like this. People comply with it. As you know, lots of people won't stay on antidepressants. And what they say is, when they've done interviews with people who've gone through this course and been prescribed exercise, they say, rather than see themselves as a victim of depression and helpless before it, that they have this sort of biological problem they can't do anything about, they say, aha, I can make a change. I can do something. It's in my willpower, and to do something that will help this problem, lift, this mood lift. So it empowers the patient in a different way that drugs do not.
Well, that's very exciting to hear. When did they implement that program in Britain?
Well, they've been trying to get GPs. It goes back about 5 years ago when they started mounting. No, that's wrong. Sorry. It was in 2007. The Mental Health Foundation there started running a campaign alerting GPs to the literature that they could, in fact, GPs there have been able to prescribe depression for other physical illnesses as part of the rehab. And now they started alerting GPs, use it for depression too. Take advantage of these already existing programs.
Prescribing exercise.
Prescribing exercise, excuse me.
Yeah.
So they mounted this campaign in 2007, and the number of doctors now GPs prescribing exercise has increased from around 4% 2 years ago, and it's up to about 25% of all doctors in Britain. And of course they want to keep this publicity campaign going and really make it a sort of a frontline therapy.
Well, that's very exciting to hear. I've not heard that before, and it's encouraging. It's somewhat shocking and surprising to find out in light of the tremendous influence that the pharmaceutical companies have over that approach, and really a serious loss of revenues. I mean, when someone's on exercise and they're not taking drugs, it's a loss of revenue. So there's going to be, I would imagine, an effort to thwart that type of intervention.
I'm sure there will, and there is a lot of pharmaceutical influence with doctors in the UK as well. But, of course, the UK has a National Health Service, and they've been spending ever greater amounts of money on antidepressants. So from that angle, they want to actually curb their spending on antidepressants because it's not giving them good results, cost-efficient results.
And I'm a really strong proponent of exercise. I've been personally exercising for well over 40 years and was actually one of the reasons why I went to medical school, to use it as a therapeutic modality. What I've learned, though, is that even though it's useful, and there's a lot of specifics with exercise because there's so many different ways. There's like 5 or 6 primary different types of exercise you can use, and they're all valid in their own way. But what I've learned is that there's other modalities, such as the foods that you're eating. If you're eating foods that are really high processed foods and high in these sugars, that's going to move your production of your neurotransmitters to the point where they're relatively unhealthy. And unhealthy fats is another issue, or to have fat deficiencies such as omega-3 fats, or a high concentration of highly damaged and toxic omega-6 fats. So these are all other elements, physical elements, that can clearly have a major influence on one's ability to contract a mental illness like depression, or certainly any of the others.
I didn't investigate this a lot, but when I was doing my research on depression, one thing I found was very interesting was the sense that depression really is a mind-body illness. And by that I mean is you do see it take hold in people who are not that physically healthy. And whether that be from diet, lack of exercise, etc. So, again, you're much more prone to depression, and for whatever reason, if you're not in good health, and eating the wrong foods can obviously contribute to that. And obviously one of the things that's happening with exercise, it's improving your overall health. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's happening with the studies on exercise, they're even showing that as your aerobic capacity improves, which is a sign of health, there's a pretty good connection to the lifting of mood with aerobic capacity. So there's a sense that depression just doesn't take hold in the mind, in the brain, that really it's this mind-body thing that happens, and that good health, good physical health, can certainly lower your risk of developing depression.